Good morning. It's always easy to introduce someone who needs no introduction. We often say that, so-and-so literally wrote the book on the subject, and we usually, by say literally, mean figuratively, but in this case, we literally mean literally. Jonathan Z.S. Pollack literally wrote the book on the history of Jews at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. In addition to having a PhD from UW-Madison and being a wonderful scholar, he, as his profile notes, played the drums for Yid Vicious at the first 3 Greenfield institutes. And he has spoken on a variety of topics, from klezmer, comedy of Mickey Katz, to all things related to history in Jews in the Midwest, Jews in Wisconsin, Jews in Madison. So without further ado, I introduce Jonathan Z.S. Pollack. We're building a Jewish home in Madison, Jewish philanthropy at the University of Wisconsin-Madison.
Thank you all for showing up this morning. It's great to see you. I'm very excited for this moment. The book is actually done. It's been 5 days, honestly, since the book finished up, since we got it. So you all have them really hot off the press. So I want to say a few things about. I realized, looking at some of my colleagues who were talking this weekend, I think I got the prize for the longest and most unwieldy title. And I want to kind of unpack it a little bit. The title was intentional. There are a bunch of ideas I was trying to get across. And they kind of have to do with the ideas of philanthropy and this university and beyond UW-Madison, public universities in general. That from the beginning, and also to go back to the beginning, the idea, the first, about the first third of the title, first quarter of the title, building a Jewish home, this idea of a Jewish home, this idea of a home on campus, was, and I'm sure I don't have to tell this to most of you, was kind of what college was supposed to be. There's a concept, a Latin phrase, in loco parentis, that translates to, like, in the absence of parents. And for most of the history of the American university and of universities around the world, that was part of the deal. That if people were sending their children away to college, they wanted to feel comfortable that their kids that it's as though they had never left home. So that's a big part of my talk today, and a big part of the philanthropy that went on. Kind of going to the second third of the title there. A lot of the philanthropy was designed to do just that. If we look back and ask ourselves, why do these organizations take an interest in college students at this particular university, it's going to come down to, because parents wanted their kids to be at home here. They wanted their kids to be safe here. They wanted to feel that their kids were going to college, even though they hadn't really left, as though they hadn't really left home. And of course, the University of Wisconsin. Jordan's 100% correct. It should be University of Wisconsin, N-Madison. But I felt like that's too much Madison in the title, and it's getting kind of redundant, and it's big enough as it is. So that's where we got that from. Within my talk, there's kind of 2 themes, 2 trajectories that I want to talk about in terms of philanthropy. And this kind of gets us into the subject of philanthropy in general. It looks like my colleagues who will be speaking this after me are going to take up this theme. It'll be kind of a fun thing over the course of the day to see how the ideas of philanthropy kind of change or remain consistent depending on how we look at it. One of the big transitions I saw, one of the big trajectories I saw as I was doing my research on Jewish history at UW was the trajectory from individual philanthropy, so individual people making it possible for other individual people to go to college and have a good experience, and how over time that kind of transitioned into institutional forms of philanthropy. So you've got philanthropic institutions that are making sure that students at large can have a positive Jewish experience at UW-Madison. Additionally, and as I was going over my talk one last time yesterday afternoon, this might be kind of a loop more than a transition, but initially the focus of Jewish philanthropy at UW-Madison was on activities, was on extracurricular activities for Jewish students. The classroom was kind of the classroom, and what goes on in there is just what goes on in there, and not really on the radar of Jewish philanthropists. But over time, much of the focus of Jewish philanthropy switched to academics. The most obvious example of that is the academic unit that brought us all here, the Center for Jewish Studies. There are earlier predecessors, and also to complicate things a little bit more, it's not as though the activity sector ever went away. That down to the present day, there's an increased number of kind of extracurricular activities designed to use philanthropy, leverage philanthropic giving to enrich Jewish life on campus. And in particular, the activities and academics, to again tie this into a bigger theme, which as I was talking to someone this morning, is something I deliberately kind of avoided in my book. I mean, my book is kind of by design very focused on University of Wisconsin and something of a vacuum. So one of the things I want to do today is to give like a little bit of background info. I recognize that most of you have close ties to UW-Madison in particular, but I'm also aware that some of you, maybe many of you, went to other universities and might be able to bring those comparisons to bear in the Q&A. That one of the things that's really interesting about Madison, and I think is sort of a pioneering thing of Jewish philanthropy at Wisconsin in the late 20th and 21st centuries, is it shows the need for a philanthropic role in public education. That historically, public education, that's like picked up by the state. Like your taxes pay for that, and states want to provide a good education for students of their state who are going on. I've lived in Madison. I've been affiliated with UW in one form or another for nearly 30 years, and that's really not the case so much here now. So Jewish philanthropy, I think, is a part of trying to adjust to that changing reality. All right. So to start out, as I always like to do when I talk about Wisconsin, I know a lot of you are from Madison and you've seen me talk about the Jewish history of this university and the city and other arenas. A couple of people I feel I need to give a shout out to pretty much every time to sort of get the ball rolling. The gentleman on the left, Philip Stein, is answering the question, who was the first Jewish person to attend UW-Madison? It's a question I get a lot. That's why Stein shows up in the book like right away in chapter 1. He's the guy. And in a lot of ways, I think Philip Stein is really important, not just because he's the first, because oftentimes when you talk about other firsts, it turns out they're not that important. Aaron Boskowitz, the first Jew in Madison, appears to have lived here for about 6 months, clerking in somebody's store before he moved on. Kind of a footnote to history. Philip Stein is quite the opposite of that. Philip Stein was the first recorded Jewish student. If anybody here has information on earlier Jews who attended UW-Madison, I'd love to hear about it. We'll make sure we get him in the second edition. But yeah, Stein really represented an exemplary model of alumni to follow. Stein graduated from UW-Madison in 1865. He became an attorney in Chicago. He was active in Jewish charitable work there, notably the B'nai B'rith, important Jewish men's lodge that I'll be talking about in a little more detail in just a few minutes. And Stein also, beginning in about 1900, was a prime benefactor of a new institution called the Wisconsin Alumni Association. Stein, the photo of Stein that I have here, you might say, well, wow, that for a 22-year-old college graduate, that guy looks like he's aged a bit. That's from a 1915 issue of the Wisconsin Alumni Magazine, the predecessor to today's On Wisconsin that many of you receive. He was the guest editor. He gave a sufficient amount that they sort of turned he had the cover story about the 50th anniversary of the class of '65, and was clearly a major league donor. In addition, on this kind of theme of the early days of Jewish philanthropy being on this kind of one-to-one level, as my colleague Jordan Rosenblum and others will be talking about this afternoon in the text study, Moses Maimonides talks about different degrees of Jewish charity, of charity in the Jewish tradition, and what is the proper way to give tzedakah. I hope I'm not spoiling it, but as I remember Maimonides, at the top of the scale is giving someone a job. And this is exactly what Philip Stein did for his fellow UW alum, Israel Shrimsky, who began here in 1888. Shrimsky was the son of very early Russian Jewish immigrants to Wisconsin who landed in Hudson, right across the river from Minnesota. Shrimsky came to UW in 1888, stayed a couple years and left before graduating. However, in the 1890s, there was no obstacle to pursuing a career in law. So Shrimsky also relocated to Chicago, became an attorney, and Philip Stein hired him to work at his firm. I have not been able to locate Shrimsky-Stein correspondence or business records of the firm to confirm this. But it seems logical that the two of them would have talked extensively about their shared time at UW-Madison, even though they were here a generation apart. Shrimsky followed and in some ways exceeded his UW mentor. Shrimsky was the prime fundraiser behind a building on campus known as the Memorial Union. So they're examples of individual Jewish philanthropists who made a big contribution. There are many others to come. I felt that the book would be exceedingly hagiographic if I simply name-checked every Jewish graduate who gave over a certain amount, and then the people or the descendants of the people who gave slightly under that would come after me and so forth. But suffice to say, and I'm sure this is lived experience to many of you, individual Jews giving to University of Wisconsin for facilities, for aspects of the universities open to everybody, Jewish and non-Jewish alike, has a long, long, long history and continues on into the present. So to get to individual cases in a little more detail, I want to talk about Louis Wolfensohn. And again, I know some of you have probably been to talks where I've discussed Wolfensohn before. He's, whenever you write a work of history, as much as historians try to remain objective and neutral and so forth, there are certain people who kind of emerge as heroes of the story. And for me, one of those early heroes is this guy here. Wolfensohn was born in La Crosse in 1882. His family also were they were part of the first wave of Russian refugees who hit the United States in 1881. In 1881, Milwaukee was overrun with Russian Jews. The German Jewish community there was simply unable or unwilling to provide for all of them, and they put out a call to smaller congregations around the state to try to take in a few Russians, find something for them to do. At that point in time, in 1880, 1881, Madison no longer had a Jewish congregation. The building known as the Gates of Heaven, the original Shirei Shamayim congregation, was basically defunct. They were an organization that maintained a cemetery plot. They leased the building at that time to, I think it was the First Unitarian Society. La Crosse, though, had a congregation. Sons of Abraham and La Crosse was already on the scene. They took in some families, among them the Wolfensohn family, where Louis was born in 1882. Louis Wolfensohn, by all accounts, seems to have been a prodigy. He graduated from La Crosse Central High School at the age of 16 and came down to the University of Wisconsin. As was true for working class and lower class college students at the time, both Jewish and not, his family moved with him. So when he came to college, his parents and his sister moved down to Madison, rented an apartment on Wilson Street near downtown, where his dad was employed, to no surprise to people who know me from other talks, where his father was employed as a low-level scrap peddler, collecting unwanted materials from houses, sorting them to be sent off and processed. The Wolfensohn family was, I would say, in abject poverty. One of the themes that I think is going to come up later on is that one of the reasons for the emergence of a whole set of specifically Jewish philanthropic organizations is that historically in Jewish communities there was a huge stigma placed on having to go on public relief. And the Wolfensohn family did just that. The records of the kind of public-private coalitions that ran charity to the indigent in Madison record that Louis Wolfensohn's dad applied for, I think it was about $20 in aid to buy firewood and fuel to run his apartment. Louis Wolfensohn, in his second semester of college, paid off that debt. Clearly had some kind of campus job and was embarrassed that his family had to go on public relief, and so he paid that advance back to the city. So Wolfensohn himself majored in what was then called Semitics. We'd now call it like ancient or biblical Hebrew. He started graduate work at UW. He moved to Johns Hopkins University, and his family moved with him to Baltimore, where he got his PhD in 1908. And then they all came back to Madison. It's at Johns Hopkins where I realized what a kind of a savant with language Wolfenson was. In addition to mastering biblical Hebrew and Aramaic and Syriac while an undergrad, at Johns Hopkins, he wrote an article on Tagalog grammar, as the U.S. had just acquired the Philippines in the Spanish-American and Philippine-American Wars. He, of course, would have known English, having lived his whole life in La Crosse. He would have known Yiddish, having parents who spoke that as a first language. So we're up to 5, 6 languages, I think, several of which use different alphabets. They're totally different linguistic systems. The number of Tagalog, Yiddish cognates, I think, is 0. So really a brilliant guy. But while Wolfenson was in college, in addition to trying to pay back his father's debt, Wolfenson needed help meeting his tuition, and so the university reached out to the remnant of the German Jewish community in Madison at that time, and also to the Hirshheimer family in La Crosse. The Hirshheimers were German Jews who had been in La Crosse since the 1850s. They ran a plow company. They were not real active in Jewish life either in Madison or La Crosse, so far as I can tell. But they chipped in $50 to make sure that Louis Wolfenson could attend college. They likely knew them. La Crosse is a very small town at that point. Its Jewish community even smaller. So Louis Wolfenson's college experience is an example of that sort of one-to-one philanthropy that marked Jewish life on campus before I'd contend there was really like anything you could call a Jewish community here. Those of you who've cracked the book know that it's really about 50 years, give or take, 40, 50 years of like a few Jewish students here and there at UW before any kind of Jewish community, any kind of Jewish organization began to emerge. So, while at Wisconsin, Wolfenson had this kind of amazing career. In addition to running to being a professor at in UW's Department of Semitics, in 1916, Wolfenson taught from what's, as far as I can tell, the first course in Yiddish on an American college campus. He ran that in 1916. I've tried and failed to find like a course syllabus or anything like that would say what were they reading, what were they doing. Given that at that time Wolfenson was also holding down a job as a proofreader with the state of Wisconsin, he was also on the Madison School Board. He was also the director of the Madison branch of the Humane Society. He was also a leader in the Jewish Community Council of Madison, kind of a very, very tiny version of the New York Kehillah that you heard about yesterday, and kind of a forerunner of the modern Jewish Federation. Wolfenson had a whole bunch of irons in the fire, plus caring for his ailing mother and sister who had some sort of disability that prevented her from going out and working. My guess is that his Yiddish class was really what we'd now call a conversational Yiddish class. That UW in the 19-teens had a language requirement, as it still does. As is still sometimes the case, there are people who kind of struggle with or kick at that language requirement and try to find a way out of it. And I suspect that Wolfenson was able to offer a Yiddish course for people who had grown up in Yiddish-speaking homes, so they could sort of sign off on their knowledge as what we'd now call native speakers, that they knew Yiddish in addition to language, and they were therefore good to go for their undergraduate degree. Beginning in 1919, Wolfenson's career took a new direction. He was off city council. The Semitics department was in trouble. It mainly existed. The Semitics department's reason for being was not so much for the Jewish students. I've kind of looked at the roster of faculty in Semitics and students who graduated with that degree. Semitics mainly existed for the education of clergy in Christian denominations who were expected to be able to read ancient Greek, biblical Hebrew, Aramaic, and so forth. That's why the UW ran those courses. Jewish students tended to, from what I can tell, Jewish students tended to avoid Semitics courses like the plague. But the people who took them, again, were ministers in denominations who required their clergy to have this knowledge before entering seminary and divinity school, and they provided that. But in 1919, Wolfenson attached himself to a movement that had begun a couple years before from the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, the umbrella organization of Reform Judaism in the United States, looked at the rising number of Jewish college students. Because also, I mean, Wisconsin was totally typical in this regard, that even though, many of us, think about, when we think about Jews in college, or at least my mind goes in this way, I'm weird, we think about Abby Hoffman's comment when Abby Hoffman, the radical from the 1960s, was asked, in the Jewish tradition, at what point is a fetus deemed viable? And Hoffman answered, when it attains a master's degree. So that's a 20th century thing. In the 19th century, even the first couple of decades of the 20th century, actually very few Jewish students went to college. The vast majority worked in family businesses in some cities, in some areas, went into the building trades, and did not go to college. But there was, right around World War I, there was a big spike in the number of Jewish students going to college, and the Reform movement saw this as a huge opportunity to kind of publicize itself. And this is an example also, this kind of like move from individual philanthropy toward collective philanthropy. Reform Judaism looked at the sons and daughters of Orthodox Jews, who were the generation who were starting to go to college in larger numbers. This generation, by the 19-teens, swamped the number of German Jews and their descendants in the United States. So if the Reform movement was going to grow, it had to bring in people from Orthodox traditions. And American universities in the 100 years ago were super hostile to Jewish tradition. We heard yesterday several speakers talked about the importance of Shabbat in Salonika, in the garment shops of New York City at around the same time. College campuses were totally unreceptive to that. Courses ran on Saturdays. You had class on Saturday. You had exams on Saturdays. Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, forget it. There's class. If you're willing to take the penalty for missing class, go ahead and do that. Class goes on as scheduled. Sundays, many colleges had mandatory chapel. Wisconsin did not have this. Wisconsin, as a public university, had done away with that, I think, in the 1850s. But the American university had this Christian and specifically sort of Protestant Christian vibe that's hard to imagine. So there was a great fear among Jewish parents. The decision to send a kid to college was kind of fraught with, on the one hand, the opportunity that higher learning presented, the ability to go into the professions, to avoid the literally backbreaking and repetitive motion industry injury, creating jobs in sweatshops and the like, hauling other people's junk around, et cetera. College represented a way out of that. But at the same time, there's a great fear among American Jewish parents that kids exposed to this overwhelmingly Protestant environment would drop their Judaism altogether. So the Reform movement saw an opportunity. They thought that perhaps college students who also, looking at this from the college student perspective, college students whose correspondence I've read during this time don't seem particularly saddened by the state of affairs. Jewish students who went to college were not agonizing especially hard about like, oh, it's Shabbos, what do I, no, not a thing. Not something they're doing. Students with that kind of, motivation were often able to attend, colleges like City College in New York City, commuter schools in their own city, where they could live at home, they could eat at their mom's Shabbos table uninterrupted. Jewish students coming out here to UW-Madison, no, not really a concern. So the Reform movement organized these student congregations, and Louis Wolfenson, as was his way, jumped in as the leader. So the image you see here, and this is one of the few that I'm going to show that's actually in the book. This is, again, from the Wisconsin Alumni Magazine. They had this is from a special section on religious life on campus. This is another sort of context for this, that lots of different religions were interested in holding on to their students through the college years. That the image that we hear so often in the media of colleges as centers of godlessness and of scoffing at the precepts of organized religion. Absolutely, this was the image of universities 100 years ago. So Catholic students had the Cardinal Newman Society. Different Lutheran churches had their student organizations. Congregationalist churches had their student auxiliaries. And the UAHC created this Jewish Students Association at campuses around the country. The one at UW-Madison, from what I would tell, there's a very thin paper trail on it, and it seems to have mainly existed for high holiday services. There was a synagogue in Madison at that point in time, Agudas Achim. Some of you went there yourselves, those of you with long roots in Madison. Down went on Park Street when Mound intersected it. But for Jewish students, Agudas Achim, I mean, perhaps if they came from the exact shtetl in Minsk, where the founders of that shul came from, it would seem like home. But otherwise, it seemed old country and not really what they were into. So the Jewish Students Organization was a way to counteract that. From the numbers they report, it sounds like they got a pretty healthy percentage of the Jewish students on campus went there for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur services. Because it's Reform and not Conservative or Orthodox, they're 2-day-a-year Jews and not 3. They brought in an occasional speaker from Reform temples in Chicago and Milwaukee, but that's about all it was. It never really took off here. And in point of fact, at pretty much every college, the Reform movement folded up its student congregations efforts in the early 1920s. The outlier, as far as I can tell, is my own undergrad alma mater, the University of Michigan. Sorry. Not sorry. It was an awesome time. Michigan's Reform Student Organization lasted into about 1930. Wisconsin's folded up in 1922, despite this hopeful picture with a auditorium. This would have been taken in what was called the Women's Building on Gilman Street. It's now the home of a Brazilian steakhouse. It's been home to a bunch of other things over the years. So that's where the Jewish Students Association held its services. But yeah, it folded up. After the failure of the Jewish Students Association, after the university's efforts to eliminate the Semitics department due to low enrollment, Louis Wolfenson saw the handwriting on the wall, briefly went to Hebrew Union College, the Reform movement's seminary in Cincinnati, Ohio, where Wolfenson served as the part-time rabbi for Sandusky, Ohio, and then switched careers altogether and worked for Jewish philanthropic organizations, specifically Jewish orphanages in Boston and Providence, Rhode Island. So after the failure of the Jewish Students Association, and in the early 1920s, as Jewish students continued to go to college in huge numbers, Jewish parents and students around Wisconsin continued to be concerned about how to provide a Jewish home for their sons and daughters at UW-Madison. One effort was locally, that here in Madison, Madison's Jewish community stepped up to try to provide a home. Madison's Hadassah had a junior Hadassah chapter by 1924, which, as far as I can tell, membership in Junior Hadassah was for Jewish women in their late teens, maybe early 20s. So it sort of straddled college and high school years at a point in time when not that many Jewish women were going to college. So this is the Wisconsin State Journal's coverage of the Seder. The article highlights that Saul Leviton, fantastic character, is the first Jew to be elected to statewide office in Wisconsin. He was Wisconsin state treasurer through most of the 20s and 30s. Saul Leviton conducted the service. Leviton was a first-generation American, came here from Lithuania, operated a store in New Glarus, moved to Madison in about 1905, ran a department store here. Leviton's big tagline was that he sold, shoot, I'm blowing the joke. Yeah, Leviton sold Bob La Follette a pair of suspenders in 1900, and he's been supporting him ever since. So, Leviton's joke, not mine, but it reflects Leviton's deep roots in the Progressive Party of Wisconsin. Those of you who know Wisconsin political history know how important that is. And Leviton was a kind of beloved state treasurer back when that office actually had stuff to do. Leviton was also he occasionally conducted services here in Madison. He was the person who on Yom Kippur had charge of the afternoon service of Mincha, so before everybody comes back. for Ne'ilah and after the big morning service. So he kind of like held down the afternoon shift. Leviton, this is the sort of guy he was. He went to a photo studio in his Yom Kippur regalia. So he had the kittel on, the white robe, and the kind of elaborate kippah and his tallis. And he had this photo circulated to newspapers throughout the country. Wisconsin State Treasurer leading Yom Kippur services. He occasionally performed weddings in Madison when the rabbi was unable to, and so it was a natural choice to lead this kind of Hadassah Seder for UW students. Leviton was kind of a showboat. He was kind of put himself out there. And it's often the case, and I'm sure to the surprise of nobody in here, the Seder was, if you go through the Madison Hadassah records, you find out that the Seder was actually organized by the then president of Madison Hadassah, Fanny Weinberg Mack, who left extensive correspondence and meeting minutes about what a darn hassle it was to put this together. That she's the one who coordinated all the cooking, who got her members to kosher their kitchens for the holiday and make stuff for the Seder so that they could go to rented quarters near campus and hold this. It's probably no surprise that almost 100 years ago, Madison roads were not the best. So people having to, she talks about people with like huge cauldrons of matzo ball soup, bumping their way to campus and spilling soup all over them in their cars. There was someone, the big help on that was someone who owned a furniture store and had an early pickup truck, kind of a flatbed pickup they could load a bunch of the stuff on, but then it was people had to sit back there and hold on to it so it wouldn't fall out the truck. Fanny Weinberg, Fanny Mack is not credited in this article, but I think she absolutely deserves it for actually pulling the thing off. So that Saul Leviton sort of come in at the last minute and lead the Seder and do this big thing would be impossible without the efforts of Madison Hadassah. Again, this is kind of in our trajectory. This is kind of a middle ground. It's a group of people engaging in philanthropic activity for another group of people on campus, but it's still very individual and very ad hoc. I think Madison Hadassah did this for a couple years, but again, it was a massive undertaking and on a very small scale. So there were calls starting in the early 1920s. It's a series of letters that ran in the Wisconsin Jewish Chronicle, the English language Jewish newspaper out of Milwaukee, that began to address the conditions at Madison. And it's kind of a fun exchange, and I talk about this in the book, so I'm just going to mention it really briefly here. I don't have like a slide for it. You can read about it. I think it's, would that be chapter 3, I want to say. So there's a woman from Milwaukee wrote a letter to the editor of the Wisconsin Jewish Chronicle. And she said, something has to be done. She said, conditions are bad for Jewish women on campus. That the facilities available are unsavory. That she was kind of referring, which is reading between the lines, she's referring to, surprise, there were lots of parties at UW-Madison. And so it's kind of party atmosphere, and she was deeply offended about this, and she talked about how if Jewish students want to get together to study, like there's no place for them to go, and can't Milwaukee step in and do something about this? Then, like a week or two later, a Jewish woman from Madison wrote in and said, hey, stop spitting on my hometown. There are absolutely wholesome Jewish boys at Madison. I don't know who you're running around with, but that does not speak for everybody. And Madison, it's really fine, and like, get over yourself, So there was kind of back and forth about this. What this tells me is there was a movement going on. There was an idea in Milwaukee that there should be some kind of home for Jewish students on campus. So there were similar conversations going on in Champaign, Illinois. That in Champaign-Urbana, kind of like Madison, it was Champaign-Urbana and Madison were both areas with very small local Jewish communities. There definitely were Jewish people there in both cities, but they were very tiny. And there were a whole lot of Jewish students who came from elsewhere, who came from at least like a few hours train ride away. For Illinois, of course, Jewish students from Chicago and from East St. Louis and elsewhere around the state of Illinois and neighboring states. And for Madison, Jewish students coming from Milwaukee and Chicago, Minneapolis, the rest of the state, et cetera. And so in both places, people kind of put their heads together. And the group, and in Champaign-Urbana, they had a really strong B'nai B'rith lodge. B'nai B'rith, as I talked about before, and here's where I'm bringing it back, it's a Jewish men's organization founded as like a lodge society in the 1840s, with the idea that it was understood that B'nai B'rith was for Jewish men. But the further definition, what do we mean by Jewish? Is it German Jews? Is it Russian Jews? Is it Litvaks? Is it Galicianers? Is it Hungarians and Romanians? Is it Orthodox or Reform? B'nai B'rith's answer to that was, it's for Jewish, is what it is. We're going to leave that stuff aside. It's for anybody who wants to be part of this. They're welcome to join a lodge. And so B'nai B'rith had kind of hit on this idea. They saw where the Reform movement had kind of failed a few years prior. And they said maybe instead of creating a Jewish home under Reform auspices, maybe B'nai B'rith auspices are the way to go. The result of that, as I'm sure I have to tell no one in here, was the B'nai B'rith Hillel Foundation, of which Wisconsin has the second one after Champaign-Urbana. So this is a shot, again, I chose this one because it's not in the book, of the Hillel Library, study session with Hillel Rabbi Solomon Landman, taken sometime in the late 1920s. So Hillel really provided this kind of home. And Hillel's really, I mean, you know, when I was writing my book, and I was trying to capture the idea of Jewish life on campus, you know, one of the things that's kind of tricky about that is, you know, Jewish students kind of make their own Jewish life. You know, if you're going to say, well, what's the definition of Jewish life? It's like, on the one hand, well, yeah, it's like the experience of any particular Jewish person. But I felt, again, to kind of narrow it down and create a product that's, you know, has some kind of focus and coherence to it, it was necessary to say, well, we're going to limit it to organizations that are specifically Jewish in nature. They're charted in that way, and so Hillel really kind of set the tone for what I'd call organized Jewish life on campus for much of the 20th century on into the present. So Hillel initially, as reflected in its title, was really like a project of B'nai B'rith. The B'nai B'rith kind of sponsored this. B'nai B'rith chapters around the country, part of members' dues, went to maintain an ever-growing network of Hillel foundations at universities in the U.S. and Canada and elsewhere, as part of almost as kind of a bridge between B'nai B'rith's youth organizations, BBYO and AZA, started also in the 1920s, and actual B'nai B'rith chapters slated, you know, targeted more for actual adults who had completed their education. So Hillel, through the 1920s and 30s, really became an aggressive, I'd say an active and very powerful center for Jewish life in Madison, analogous, as I mentioned before, with the Jewish Students Organization, analogous to religious societies for undergraduate students, a source of social life, a source for performing arts. Hillel had a newspaper that came out once a week, sometimes more than that, from the 1920s and 30s into the 1940s. Really like a center for Jewish life on campus. But again, the philanthropy there, it's on this much more sort of abstract group level, that UW was one of a whole network of these foundations maintained, for the most part, by a central organization headquartered elsewhere. By World War II, again, was another opportunity for the local Madison Jewish community and the campus Jewish community to work together. This photo here is another one, and again, this is it's of a similar series, but not the one that's in the book, of the Hillel and Madison Jewish Welfare Board Seder from 1943. It's obviously World War II. You can see in the it's not like a theme Seder where it's like everybody wears sailor suits. No, these are like bona fide uniformed U.S. servicemen. The Madison Jewish Welfare Board was the predecessor to the modern Jewish Federation of Madison. That came into being in 1940. And right before World War II, right before the U.S. entered World War II, by 1943, Hillel and the Madison's Jewish Welfare Board partnered to put on these truly epic seders that took place at various spots around town. One of them at the First Congregational Church down on the corner of Old University and Breeze Terrace, right across from the stadium. One of the biggest obstacles they had, as far as I can tell, was trying to find a space big enough to accommodate all the demand. Many of the people who came through, although these guys are pretty clearly Navy, one of the big sources of Jewish soldiers in the area was Truax Air Base, which is now the Madison Area Technical College campus where I teach, where my main job is. Truax was a training center for the Army Air Corps. And over the years that I've been speaking on local Jewish history and just getting to know people in the community, I've met a number of people who met their spouses that way, where she was living in Madison, either in university or not, and he was stationed here from somewhere else, and they met at one of these seders, they met at one of the dances organized by Hillel and the Jewish Welfare Board. That it's, I think, in a lot of family histories, it's a very important moment in this kind of Jewish philanthropy of bringing people together during a very tense time. So, in some ways, and starting as early as 1944, Hillel kind of became a victim of its own success. Its original quarters on 508 State Street, the present site of, I'm forgetting what the restaurant is there now. It's Kabul. It's a Kabul restaurant on State Street. Those who've been there, it's like a decent-sized restaurant, but as far as the Hillel goes, it's very tiny. So starting in 1944, it was clear to Hillel leaders that they needed their own building, that renting quarters on State Street, even though State was a great location, it's close to the university, it's close to where students live and where they eat and where they shop and so forth. It was a great location that way, but it's just too small. So they started looking for property, and so for the first time, Hillel had to embark on an aggressive fundraising campaign. The campaign in the end took somewhere between like 12 and 13 years, beginning in 1944, lasting over the terms of 2 different Hillel rabbis. And what I put up here again, it was an illustration I liked, and the graphics and editor on the project disagreed with me, but I love this. It's a Hillel brick. And so this was like a way for people to donate to Hillel on kind of a small donor fashion. You can see on here that the cost of this brick is $1. And I looked it up, and assuming this is from roughly 1950, $1 at that point is worth like $8 or $9 today on how you calculate it. So to buy a brick, it's to kick in like $8, $9. A 2 for 18 would be a kind of classic pitch if we were still doing this. And this is a way for people to give. What I found really interesting about going through like the fundraising documents for the Hillel building in the 1940s and 50s is that the focus of the campaign was on Jewish communities around Wisconsin.